I spend a lot of my time working with students around the world, or PhD candidates mainly, in many different parts of the world. And what I find is that a lot of the time those people have become sort of quite stuck on the literature, because the literature seems vast, and we don't know exactly where to start, how to go about it. And sometimes I've even encountered people who spent years on this and not really ever started their dissertation. So I don't take it lightly when I say that I think that we can get quite far in 10 days if we have the right tools for the job. So I work in a department of political science, and I mainly teach methodology, but I also do teach undergraduates in the realm of philosophy and comparative government and so on. But I guess my first love is to really work with people who are trying to get going with their research. And I know that it can be a really scary place sometimes. It's a really fun place as well. But I do meet a lot of people who are finding it quite lonely, scary, wondering if it's just them that don't have the tools. Everybody else knows, and it's just you that doesn't know. And there's this secret that someone's not telling you. So I really have decided in this kind of part of my life to try to make a difference to that place of fear that we sometimes find people in with writing, with literature reviewing, with all the different tasks that are involved in getting published, say, for example, or getting going with a master's or a PhD dissertation. So that's what I'm about, and you're more than welcome to put any questions you might have about me in the chat, and I'll answer. But to get on with talking about the literature review itself, I want to just pause for a moment and ask you to just think about something, right? Think about what for you makes a good conversationalist. In other words, somebody who you really want to talk to. They're good at making conversation, right? Just try and picture that person in your mind for a minute. What are the characteristics of that person who's good at making conversation? Or if you want to flip it, the person who's really bad at making conversation, the person who, if you meet them at the water fountain, you actually want to avoid them because they're not somebody you particularly want to speak to. So if I just pause for a minute and ask you to think about that, what would be those characteristics of a good conversationalist, right? If we were in the room together, we might write them down, we might share them with our neighbor and so on. But typically, if I'm going to make a wild guess, I think that one of the things that would be top on your list, on many of our lists of a good conversationalist, would be someone who's a good listener, right? So where am I going with that? If, say, for example, Kirsty and I, our CEO, are having a long conversation, and it's a really important conversation, right? And this conversation has been raging for 3 hours. And along comes Jessica, and we're 3 hours into our conversation, and Jessica joins our conversation and just starts talking, right? Now, Kirsty and I would be thinking to ourselves, well, I wonder why she's talking, because actually the things that she's speaking about were things that we covered in the first hour of the conversation, right? So why is Jessica not taking a moment to listen to the conversation before entering it? Another kind of characteristic that people often will list as a characteristic of a bad conversationalist would be someone that just interrupts the conversation, somebody that doesn't enter the conversation at a point that is meaningful, right? Who talks over people, who wants to say something about everything and doesn't really have something meaningful to contribute to the conversation. I'm willing to bet that those would be some of the kinds of things that you would have listed if we were in the room together and we were talking about a good and a bad conversationalist. So this brings me then to, why we do the literature review. And what we are really doing when somebody asks you to do a literature review, what they are really doing is they're asking you to show that you're a good conversationalist. In other words, that you have listened to the conversation before entering it. That's really all it is, right? So it's not some weird thing. If you just think about it logically and like a normal person, you'll understand that it doesn't make any sense to enter into a conversation if you haven't listened to what that conversation is actually about before entering it. So before we can even begin our research, we need to have a sense of what the existing conversation is about. So when we do a piece of research, we do a piece of academic work, what we are essentially doing is we are entering a conversation about something or other. Now, one of the challenges actually is to understand what conversation you're entering, right? So if you imagine we're at a cocktail party and there's people having little conversations all over the place, right? Those conversations are about different things. Which conversation are you actually entering? Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a random subject, right? Something like learning, childhood learning, how people learn, right? So you could tell me that is the thing that you're interested in. But with a research project on learning, there could be many different conversations that we're actually entering. Are we actually entering a conversation about pedagogy? Are we actually entering a conversation about parenting and learning? Are we actually entering a conversation about child development, et cetera, et cetera? So one of the challenges that you face with your work is to understand exactly what conversation it is that you're entering, and then to listen to that conversation in order that you might enter it at a meaningful point, right? You're not just going to say a bit about this and a bit about this, and you've got something to say and something to say, but it's really important that we have the tools to be able to listen to that conversation in order to be able to enter it at a meaningful point, right? So we add value to the conversation. It would be weird behavior if Jessica and I were having a conversation and then Kirsty came along and she repeated what I've just said in slightly different words. We'd be saying, well, maybe there's something a little bit wrong with Kirsty, because why is she just saying what we're already saying, right? So nobody's going to want to publish your work. Nobody's going to want to give you a PhD if you are just saying what other people have already said, right? So often people who are doing literature reviews are trying to find what I'm calling a gap in the conversation, right? And that is really important because it is the way in which you demonstrate that you're going to add value to the conversation. In other words, that you should be speaking and that we should listen to you, that your article should be published, that we should give you a PhD, because if something to say that is different, but we can only know that it's different if we've listened to the conversation. Okay, so we say then that this process of trying to find the gap is where our research problems come from, right? So we look at the literature in order to come to an understanding of what is not known. And what I like to say to people is the fact that you don't know it doesn't mean that it's not known. So it's actually quite understandable that it's a big and daunting task to find this gap in the literature, because it means that you've got to be able to say quite authoritatively that this really is a gap in knowledge, right? And clearly, one of the things you can't do is go out and read everything. So there must be some other thing that people mean when they talk about reviewing the literature. And especially if somebody is mad enough to say, well, crazy enough to say, well, you can do it in 10 days, right? So what could that process be? And we need to undertake that process because that's where the research problem comes from. The research problem doesn't come from anywhere else, right? So I want to argue that research problems come from one place and one place only, and that is the existing conversation, the existing literature. So one of my mantras is to say that we do research about things that we are curious about, not just that we are cross about. Okay, so that's a mantra of mine. Curious, not just cross. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of us have ideas for what we might want to do research about because we're cross about something. I'm using cross as a big umbrella term. We're passionate about something, we care about something, something is wrong in the world, and so we want to do research about that thing. So that's perfectly understandable. But not everything that we're cross about, in other words, not everything that we're interested in and passionate about and so on, is a research problem. Okay, so some of those problems might be political problems or advocacy problems or problems about this or that. But to make it a research problem, in other words, researchable, something that is worth doing research about, it must be something that we remain curious about. In other words, it is a question that we don't have an answer to. So there's lots of things that we're cross about. We might be cross about, childhood malnutrition or something like that. But to find the research problem within that, we need to have had a look at the literature and say, well, what are all the things that we already know about childhood malnutrition? Because then we can go and use that knowledge to go and advocate or change policy or do whatever. But in order for it to become a research problem, what does the word research actually mean? If you think about the word, it means to look again, to research, to look again. So it has to be something that's worth looking at again in order to add to understanding, right? So that's why we do the literature review, because we're interested in, well, what are all the answers that people have already given, and therefore, what is there left to be curious about, right? So I've covered most of these points, and you can have a look at them yourself. But really what we're interested in is demonstrating to the existing members of a conversation that we have something to add. And when you develop a research proposal, for example, that is the critical thing that those people reviewing your proposal will want to have a look at, is you're proposing to do this, but why are you going to look again? How can you convince me as the reader that this is something worth looking at again, researching? Okay. So if we do this rigorous mapping process that I am talking about, it increases the credibility of our project, right? It makes people sit up and say, oh, okay, well, I can see why that is worth doing, and I can see why it's worth doing in that particular way. Right. So when we enter any field of research or what I'm calling any conversation, think broadly about that, sometimes people get a bit weird when they're starting to think about writing a dissertation and they forget their normal intelligence. So if you just think about your normal intelligence, if you were building a house, you wouldn't just go and put your house somewhere. You would map the terrain firstly, wouldn't you? You would think about, well, what does this terrain look like in this area where I'm thinking about building my house, right? And in that area, if you think about it like that, there would be some places where there's lots of people living, and then there'd be some places where maybe fewer people are living, and there's some places where it's desert. It's not worth trying to build there. It's not a flourishing type of area. And there's other places that look green and faceland and a good place to maybe build a house. So we're mapping the terrain. We're thinking about what does this territory look like? And it is the territory of the conversation that you're entering, right? So you can't just go and hang out in someone's village, right? You have to have a map. You have to understand how life in that village is working. Who's fighting with who? What are the debates about? What is the history of how people came to settle in one part and then more sparsely settle in a different part? So we're thinking about this terrain that we're entering, and we're wanting to understand how it's working. And we need a good procedure for that. We need a good mapping technique, right? If you think about how people make maps, they fly high in the sky and they make an aerial photograph. So they have a bird's eye view. They're looking over the whole of the terrain and they're able to say what it looks like from that bird's eye view. And that is really the sort of sensibility that you want when you're looking at your literature review. You're wanting to provide the reader with this map of the terrain. And you're doing that with a very specific purpose. The purpose is to be able to say, well, I'm going to build my house here. I'm going to make my research project here. And it makes sense because the terrain looks like this and like this. Okay. So we are looking for this bird's eye view or map of the terrain. If you can imagine, if you can see this picture on the slide, if you were deep inside these streets, you wouldn't be able to see, the rest of the terrain. You would be able to see the buildings around you. And sometimes that's what people do, is they kind of establish a little, they do almost like an essay, which is about the stuff that they're interested in. But a literature review is not like that. A literature review is giving us an overview also of stuff that you're not actually going to do, right? Maybe you're not doing a quantitative study, but if you're going to give me a map of the terrain, you need to be able to tell me that there have been quantitative studies. And those quantitative studies have been in this area of my research. It's not what I'm doing, but they're part of the terrain. They're part of how people have tried to answer the question that we're interested in. Okay, so the kind of mapping exercise would be about what are the family groups? How do these family groups relate to one another? How have these debates among them evolved historically? And what is the current state of their relationships? So in sum, then, a lot of the time we get used to writing essays on things, and a mapping exercise is not that, right? So what we are actually searching for is a question. We're not searching for an answer. And that's quite a big mind shift, I find, a lot of the time for people to take, because a lot of the time we have grown up in universities using literature to answer a question. You get an essay question and people say, right, use this and this and this literature and answer the question, right? Now, a literature review to map the terrain is exactly the opposite of that. We are not writing an answer to a question. We are writing about what we think our question should be. So in other words, another way of saying what a literature review is to say that it is an argument for a question. So it's not an argument about the thing in the world. So another of my mantras then, we've got curious, not just cross, is word, not world. So in this instance, we are using the literature to provide a picture of the word. In other words, to write about the literature. What does the literature look like on this particular subject? We're not using it to write about something in the world, to answer some question about the world. That will be what our research is for, okay? We're going to do research in order to answer that. So what kinds of things would we include then in this literature review? We might be looking at debates and whether or not some sort of consensus has been reached. We might want to make sure that we have some tools to be able to tell who are the main speakers, who are the big cheeses in this literature, right? Because if you want to submit an article for publication or a proposal or a thesis, and you completely ignore the main speakers in the conversation, and you are essentially then reporting on some side issue, and you're ignorant of the main speakers in the conversation, then that would obviously be quite weird, right? So you want some procedure to be able to tell who are the main speakers, and to be able to tell authoritatively, right? It's not just a thumb suck. It's you really know that these are the main people. You might want to provide some sort of genealogy or history of the evolution of the field. As much as you want to include the very up-to-date stuff, it's very interesting and useful to be able to say, how did this conversation evolve over time? in the 70s, people were talking about this, and then the debate shifted and it became about this, and now we're talking about this other thing, right? We need to make sure that we have some procedure for identifying what the key debates are right now, what the seminal texts are. Also, what kinds of methods have people been using in this field to answer the questions that they've been trying to ask within this broad topic area that we're interested in. So if you look at this little crude graph that I've got here, obviously you continue reading and consulting literature throughout the life of a project, and sometimes a PhD project can span many, many years. But the important thing is that what you see in this little graph is that you attack the literature aggressively at the beginning stages, because nothing can really be done until you have a sense of what the conversation is, so that you can ask a meaningful question. Okay. Now, how exactly would we go about that then? So remember that we are talking about reviewing, not reading. So that's often like a moment for people. They say, what do you mean? So I shouldn't be reading? And I'm going to say absolutely not. Because if you think about it, if I'm saying that you should have a bird's eye view of the whole of the terrain of this conversation that you're entering, well, then we are going to be talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of research published in articles, journals, PDFs, books, and so on. So it cannot be the case that anybody can be expecting you to read all of that. And then, even worse, what people will do is they'll begin trying to summarize things. And it's not surprising then that you become very, very bogged down and very intimidated by the task, because you're thinking, well, I've got to read this stuff to be able to draw the map. And that would be a little bit like being in among all those buildings and thinking that you have to look at, go up and down in the elevator in each and every building in order to look at each and every building. That's not what a mapping exercise is. It's not entering each and every building. No mapper does that. It's hovering above and getting that bird's eye view. So we need tools to be able to do that. And the second one is that we never review without doing some kind of writing. So for me, if we're not writing, we're not doing academic work. So writing and thinking for me are simultaneous processes. But I've already said that one thing that we definitely shouldn't be doing is summarizing anything, because it's just going to take far too long. And for me, it's a completely pointless exercise. So what could we be meaningfully writing if we're not summarizing? So two rules then, and the first one would be, we're not going to be reading every article, and we're not going to be summarizing. So one of the little tools that I do like to use is what I call a cum chart, and it's just a simple chart in which you begin to kind of hone your skills for entering critically into the conversation. And in this simple tool, we are using the K column to write down what the known is. We're using the U column to write down the unknown, and then the M column stands for me. And this is just a different way of entering into looking at literature. You're not looking at literature to gather all the information that an author has put into that article, but rather, as you look at literature, your question that should be sort of bugging you in the back of your mind is, what do people already know about this? Because I don't want to enter the conversation and start talking about what's already known. So I don't have to read the whole article, but what I want to have a look at is, what are they saying we already know, right? And then what are they saying about the unknown? Now, that unknown column may shift and change and morph as your project develops, because in the beginning, there might be things that you think are unknown, but you have a look at another piece of research and you realize actually people do know that. They've covered it. And so it shifts to the known column. And then very importantly, the M column is where you begin to just write. And remember, this kind of writing, it's only for you. So you don't have to sound fancy, you don't have to sound sophisticated. It's just a place to freely record your thoughts. And it's something that I like people to use because it means that you are thinking while you're engaging literature. So it's not just a blank slate kind of approach where the literature is you're thinking it's just going to empty into you, but rather you're engaging in a thoughtful way, and you're thinking about, well, what's known, what's unknown, and then you're also thinking about, who am I, and which are the kinds of things about the unknowns that interest me, because ultimately it's your project and you have to develop the project using stuff from the unknown column, but you're not going to contribute to every gap in the conversation. You're not going to say something about everything that's unknown, because that would be a poor conversationalist. That would be a bad conversationalist, somebody who wants to say something about everything that we don't know, but rather to choose carefully and thoughtfully where you fit into this conversation. So that's one tool. Now, another tool, and this is really the crux, is the tool that we might use to dealing with all of those PDFs. Now, I'm willing to bet that if you're embarking on some sort of piece of research, or you're in the middle of a project or whatever, I'm willing to bet that you've downloaded a lot of PDFs. And those are sitting somewhere on your laptop, on your computer. And what I also find a lot of the time is that when people get a bit panicked about their work and they're not quite sure what to do, then one of the things they do is they go and search, and then maybe they get some more PDFs and they put those on their computer. And so you end up with more and more of these PDFs. And actually, the more you have and the more you're not doing anything with them, the more panicked you get. And so then you get more panicked, so you go and get more PDFs. And it's not surprising that panic sets in, because it becomes more and more overwhelming, because we're not really sure what to do with them. You might start summarizing a few, but that seems very tedious, and maybe you can get through like one a day or something like that, and yet they're hundreds. So what do you do? Some of the really diligent people start to organize them into folders. And so you've got folders and subfolders, but actually you still haven't really done anything. You still haven't gained an insight into what the conversation is about. So actually my number one tool that I want to introduce you to this evening, and which I would suggest that you use, and I'm quite surprised when I meet lots and lots of people all over the world who aren't doing this or aren't thinking about it like this. Okay, so to give you the background to the idea, think about, you were reporting this conversation that Jessica and I were having for 3 hours, and you go to say somebody like your mom, and you are going to now report this conversation, because that is what you're doing. Remember, in your literature review, you're asked to tell the reader what the existing conversation is about. So think to yourself, well, how would I actually go about reporting that conversation to mom? If you were reporting the conversation to mom, you would not say, well, you know what, mom, in the first 15 minutes, Jessica said, and then mom, in the next 15 minutes, Louise said, and then, your mom's going to be, come on, tell me what the conversation was about. I don't have time for this, right? So it's not a good way of reporting the conversation. And yet we sometimes see that in literature reviews, where people will say, this author said that, and then another author said that, and another author said that, which is not good literature review practice. So if you think about the kinds of things that your mom would be expecting, what kinds of things might she be expecting? Who was talking, right? Who are the main speakers? And then what were they talking about? What were the main topics or themes or debates or questions? What were the main points of contention? Were they fighting about something? Were they debating something? Did they reach some sort of consensus? Were there clear sides? Were there other people listening in on the conversation? And some of them contributed here and there, and some of them were on Jessica's side, and some were on Louise's side. Did the sides shift over time? And where was this conversation taking place? What was the location? And were they using different methods? Was Jessica coming at it more from a psychological angle, and Louise was coming at it more from a pedagogical angle? Was the theoretical framings to what they were saying? Those would all be kind of quite useful ways of giving mom a bird's eye view or overview of this conversation. So if that's what's required of you, that is how you are meant to now go about reporting this conversation, what can you do? What can you do with all of those hundreds of PDFs that you've gathered, right? So what we would like to do then is to develop a literature review matrix or chart. And this is a way of writing without summarizing. We've already got our cum chart as one of our tools. But if you develop your categories that you want to report the conversation to mom in, right? Then this becomes your literature review chart or matrix. So here are some of the headings, but you can have whatever headings seem to make sense for you within your faculty, within your discipline, within your topic. I like to have a column for the journal. What journal is this appearing in? What method did the people use in this particular study? Where was the place that the study was located? Was it in Canada? Was it in Kenya? Where was the place that they were studying? And what were their main findings? What did they find out? If there's a debate, can I discern what position they're taking within that debate? What theoretical framing were they using for this particular article? Who were the authors? Who was speaking? What was their research question or hypothesis? And so on and so forth. So the way that I think about this is that approach your PDFs, okay? This is how I like to think about it. Approach your PDFs as if they were participants in a survey that you are conducting. So each and every PDF is a participant, right? So we all know how a survey works. Survey works, I come with a piece of paper and I've got my survey and I've got my questions that I'm going to ask you, and you're my participant. In this case, your survey instrument is this literature review matrix. These are the questions that you want to ask of that particular PDF or academic article. You want to know what journal, method, location, findings, question, etc., etc. And you ask the article those questions, and then you fill in those findings in your chart, it can be an Excel spreadsheet, it can just be a simple table in a Word document, or whatever you choose, right? And I would argue that most of this information would actually be found in the abstract of the article. The abstract of the article usually tells you, this is what we wanted to find out, this is the method that we used to find it out, and this is what we actually found out. And there would be, obviously, the authors would be there, the journal, and so on. Might be a little bit more tricky to find out what the theoretical framing is. It takes a bit more practice, but often we interview somebody for a survey and they don't answer all the questions. So don't panic if you can't fill in each and every column in your matrix. But a lot of that information will actually be in the abstract. And that is why I think that you can go through a PDF and fill in the answers to your survey questions quite quickly. I would say no more than 10 minutes to fill in each and every column in your survey instrument. And if you add those up, it means that you can do 6 an hour, right? If you're doing 10 minutes is probably too much. As you get quicker and quicker at it, you could probably fill in your survey instrument for each and every PDF in about 5 minutes or less than 10 minutes. So 6 an hour. And the nice thing about this is that you can do one. And while you're waiting for a child to finish a sports activity, or while you're waiting for a staff meeting to start, or you're in your car, or whatever the case might be. And it's a way of filling those small amounts of time, because when you've got a big project on your hands, it's really important that you don't think to yourself, well, I can only do work when I've got a block of time available, because, you know, life happens and none of us have got a block of time available. It doesn't work like that. So use your survey instrument and get through those PDFs really fast. And what you would then do with that, I actually don't want to do, I don't want to do that next. Okay. I want to, before I go into books, I want to finish this. And that is to say that what you will be using this data for, it is data to write your literature review, okay? So as you have filled in that survey, and perhaps
Louise, we are losing you a bit. It looks like she might
the
be.
time. Findings, all those entries in your survey instrument would be used to write your literature review. And so that analysis would be looking at the methods and correlating that with the date and saying, okay, well, in the 70s, they were mainly using quantitative work, but in the 80s, they started to do more qualitative work. That is what a literature review is. It is an analysis, and you're able to make these powerful literature review statements, which is to say, for example, the bulk of work done in this field to date has been of a quantitative nature. That's a powerful literature review statement. It's a bird's eye view over the whole field, and you're able to say the bulk of the work to date has been quantitative, and the bulk of the work to date has been conducted in North America. These are all ways in which we begin to find where the gap in the conversation is. So that's the one thing. Using a chart or a matrix to interview your PDFs to gather the data, and then that data will be used. An analysis of that data is essentially what your literature review is. The last thing I want to show you tonight is just a cool thing about Google Books, because of course, a lot of us are using Google Scholar, or whatever it is that we're using to search for stuff for our projects. But how do we deal with books now? I've already spoken about how to deal with articles and PDFs, but often books is an even more daunting. Visual advice, people always say, read the title, read the blurb, look at the table of contents, introduction and that interest you, and so on. The new version you're able to do is at the bottom here. You can key in a term. So instead of having to look through the whole of that book, you could go through
Sorry, everyone. It seems like Louise is having some
saying
difficult
about
connection issues.
classic Google. Yes.
Sorry, Louise. There's some connection issues. We're kind of losing you a bit. I just wanted to bring it to your attention. I'm not sure if you realized you were frozen for a bit.
I didn't. I'm gonna stop if it just shout if I disappear again. So I was saying that I quite like using classic Google Books. So it won't take you directly there, but there is a place, and I just want to give you that tip, which is to go back to classic Google Books. And if you go back there, it does, there's a little place where you can look for about this book. And what they have actually done is to develop these word clouds. Now, I think that's just such a cool thing. And what I would do is for my literature review matrix, I would actually cut and paste those word clouds into the books part of my literature review matrix. Because just for those of you who don't know, the way that a word cloud works is that the words that are bigger and darker are the ones that are the more prominent themes in that book. So in this particular book, I can see that, for example, systems theory and organizational communication and charter schools and so on are some of the big main themes. And then there's a whole lot of other themes that are covered in that particular book. So in a way, this is a summary of the book. It is a summary of the main themes of the book. So if I cut and paste all of those word clouds into my literature review matrix, I can very quickly say, I can put in, as I say, 100 books in a morning, no problem. And I have a quick overview of everything that is being covered in that book and what the most prominent things are. And the really cool thing about this is that you can click on any one of these and it will take you to the pages in the book where those particular issues are dealt with. So if I'm particularly interested in charter schools, from where I've pasted this into my document, it still becomes, clickable, searchable, or whatever the fancy technological term is, Kirsty will tell us. And I can click on those hyperlinks and it'll take me immediately to the book and to the particular pages in the book. And so again, that would become more data. So in this sense, I'm interviewing the books and I put that data into my literature review matrix, and I'd be able to write about the literature review. Now, when I write about the literature review, the last thing that I want to say this evening is just go all the way to the end of that. And this is to say that we write about the world, not the word. Now, what I've got here on this screen is just a little example of where I think somebody does it really well, and it demonstrates what I mean by analyzing the data from our matrix and then writing about the word, not the world. If you look at this, you will see that each and every sentence in this little block says nothing. It happens to be a literature review on prostitution, and the person wanted to do a phenomenological study on prostitution, and so they were making an argument for why that should be an approach, why that was a gap in the literature. And you'll see that each and every sentence in just this little extract that I've got, which I think demonstrates it so well, doesn't talk about prostitution. It talks about the literature on prostitution in various ways. So in reviewing the literature, there are a number of things that become apparent. Of relevance in this work is that there's little that takes a phenomenological approach. There's a noticeable absence of work about blah, blah, blah. And on it goes, right? It talks about how women's voices are absent from this work, and so on and so forth. So that is what we mean by a literature review. It is talking about the nature of the existing conversation or literature, not reaching any conclusions about prostitution, but telling us what the literature about prostitution to date has said and has not said, and therefore I should be doing my research about this. Okay.